The moment you understand where not to put salt, your life begins to change. Because salt is powerful. Salt preserves. Salt intensifies. Salt draws out what is already inside. And that is exactly why misplacing salt can ruin what God is trying to heal, grow, and transform in you. Some people are not failing because they lack faith, prayer, or effort. They are failing because they keep putting salt on places where salt was never meant to go. They keep intensifying wounds that were meant to heal, preserving memories that were meant to fade, and seasoning relationships that God was trying to remove. What you keep adding salt to will not die. It will only become stronger. And that is why wisdom is not just about what you do, but also about what you refuse to feed. There are 3 places in life where salt must never be applied. These places look harmless at first, even logical. You think you are being honest, strong, or realistic. But in reality, you are sabotaging your own future. You are slowing your healing. You are resisting God's process. And until you learn to stop seasoning these areas, you will keep wondering why the pain still burns, why peace feels distant, and why progress feels delayed. Salt is not just a seasoning. It is a force that changes whatever it touches. It preserves, intensifies, and draws out what already exists. When applied correctly, salt protects food from decay and brings out its best flavor. But when applied in the wrong place, it ruins what could have healed or ended naturally. This is why understanding the power of salt becomes a powerful metaphor for understanding life. Many people struggle not because they lack faith, effort, or desire to grow, but because they keep strengthening the very things that are meant to fade. Whatever you consistently add emotional energy, attention, and focus to will not weaken. It will survive and often grow stronger. This is the danger of misplacing salt in life. When salt is applied to pain, it does not heal it, it makes it burn. Emotionally, people relive painful experiences by constantly replaying memories, retelling stories, and reopening wounds that time and God were already closing. Each time the mind revisits the hurt with bitterness or resentment, it intensifies the pain instead of releasing it. The pain may be real, but feeding it keeps it alive. Pain becomes louder when it is rehearsed, and what is rehearsed becomes a permanent resident in the heart. This is why some people feel stuck in the same emotional state for years, even though the situation itself ended long ago. Salt also preserves unhealthy patterns. When someone keeps focusing on disappointment, betrayal, or loss, those experiences do not fade. They become the lens through which life is viewed. Trust becomes difficult. Joy feels unsafe, and peace seems temporary. This is not because healing is impossible, but because salt has been applied where it should not be. Attention gives power. Energy gives strength. Focus gives permanence. What you consistently revisit will resist leaving. This is why wisdom is not just about what you do, but also about what you refuse to keep feeding. The same principle applies to broken relationships and expired seasons. When emotional attachment, guilt, or fear is added to something that is already weakening, it keeps that connection alive beyond its purpose. Salt preserves, and many people unknowingly preserve what God is trying to remove. They keep investing emotion, time, and mental space into relationships or situations that no longer produce growth. As a result, peace erodes while the connection survives. What remains alive begins to drain what is truly needed for the future. Salt also intensifies identity. When mistakes and failures are repeatedly revisited, they become labels instead of lessons. The mind begins to associate worth with past actions, and confidence dries up under the weight of self-judgment. Even when forgiveness has been granted, self-condemnation keeps the past alive. The mistake no longer exists in reality, but salt keeps it active in memory. This is how shame survives long after grace has already done its work. What makes salt dangerous in the wrong place is that it feels justified. Revisiting pain feels like being honest. Holding on to relationships feels like loyalty. Remembering mistakes feels like humility. But in truth, these actions often strengthen what was meant to weaken. Healing does not require constant remembrance. It requires release. Growth does not demand preservation of everything. It requires discernment. Maturity understands when to let things die naturally instead of artificially keeping them alive. What you strengthen emotionally will shape your future. If pain is strengthened, it becomes perspective. If fear is strengthened, it becomes limitation. If regret is strengthened, it becomes identity. Life responds to focus. Where attention flows, energy follows. Where energy goes, growth happens. This is why misplacing salt can quietly sabotage progress while appearing harmless on the surface. Understanding this truth changes how you approach life. Instead of asking why something hasn't ended, healed, or left, you begin asking whether you're still feeding it. You realize that some struggles are not battles to fight, but habits to stop. Some doors close only when you stop touching them. Some wounds heal fully only when they are left alone. Some seasons end only when attention shifts forward. When salt is used wisely, it enhances what is good. When it is misplaced, it preserves what is harmful. The power is not in the salt itself, but in where it is applied. Once you understand that what you keep salting will keep surviving, you gain the freedom to choose where your energy goes. And when you stop strengthening what was meant to fade, you create space for healing, peace, and growth to finally take root. Not every ending is a loss, and not every separation is a failure. Some endings are answers to prayers you once whispered in pain, and some separations are acts of protection disguised as disappointment. Yet one of the greatest struggles people face is knowing when to let go of relationships that God is trying to remove, because salt preserves, and when emotional attachment, guilt, fear, or nostalgia is added to a relationship that has already served its purpose, it keeps that connection alive beyond its season. What was meant to end gently begins to linger, painfully draining peace, clarity, and spiritual strength. Many people assume that if a relationship mattered, it must last forever. But purpose does not always equal permanence. Some people are assigned to walk with you through a chapter, not the entire book. They help shape you, teach you, and stretch you for a season. Then their role is complete. When God begins to remove, a relationship is often subtle. Conversations change. Values stop aligning. Growth becomes one-sided. Peace disappears. Instead of clarity, there is confusion. Instead of strength, there is exhaustion. These are not signs to fight harder. They are signs to listen more closely. Preserving such relationships often comes from fear of loneliness, fear of starting over, fear of disappointing others, or fear of letting go of what once felt safe. So salt is applied. You make excuses for behavior that hurts you. You silence your intuition. You normalize disrespect. You compromise boundaries. You tell yourself things will change, even when patterns have proven otherwise. The relationship survives, but you slowly shrink. Your joy fades, your confidence weakens, and your spiritual sensitivity dulls. What you preserve begins to cost you more than it gives. God never removes people to harm you. He removes them to heal you. When a relationship consistently pulls you away from peace, integrity, and purpose, it is not love. It is misalignment. Love does not require you to abandon who you are becoming. Growth will always demand change, and change often requires release. Holding on to relationships that resist growth keeps you tied to a version of yourself that God is asking you to outgrow. One of the most dangerous misunderstandings is believing that prayer can revive what God has already released. Prayer is not meant to resurrect expired connections. It is meant to align the heart with divine will. When God closes a door, repeatedly knocking on it only delays your progress. Letting go does not mean you failed. It means you trusted God more than familiarity. Some relationships cannot go where God is taking you, not because they are bad, but because they are not built for the next season. Salted relationships often survive through memory rather than reality. You remember who they were, not who they are. You cling to past moments instead of present patterns. Nostalgia becomes the glue that holds everything together, even when the present is empty of peace. But memory is a poor foundation for a future. God operates in truth, not sentiment. He leads forward, not backward. When you finally stop preserving what God is removing, clarity returns, emotional weight lifts, energy shifts, space opens for healthier connections that align with your growth. You realize that peace was never lost. It was buried under loyalty to something that had already ended. Releasing does not dishonor what was, it honors what is coming. Letting go is not weakness, it is wisdom. It takes strength to walk away from what feels familiar and faith to trust what you cannot yet see. But every time God removes something, he does so with purpose. He never subtracts without intention to add. When you stop salting relationships that no longer serve your calling, you allow God to lead you into connections that nurture, support, and grow with you. Some endings feel painful because they are holy. They mark the transition from who you were to who you are becoming. And when you trust God enough to let go without preserving what he has already released, you discover that freedom was waiting on the other side of obedience. One of the most silent but powerful ways people sabotage their future is by continually returning to their past mistakes and placing salt on what God has already forgiven. Salt preserves, and when it is applied to failures, regrets, and wrong decisions, those moments stay alive far longer than they were ever meant to. Even after repentance, growth, and change, many people keep themselves trapped in cycles of shame and self-doubt because they refuse to let yesterday die. God moves forward, but the mind stays behind, replaying scenes that no longer define the present. Mistakes are meant to be teachers, not prisons. They reveal wisdom, shape character, and redirect direction, but they were never designed to become identities. When someone constantly reminds themselves of what they did wrong, the mistake stops being a lesson and becomes a label. Confidence erodes slowly, not because ability is gone, but because self-trust is weakened. Even opportunities begin to feel intimidating, not because they are beyond reach, but because the heart feels unworthy to receive them. This is how salting the past poisons the future without anyone noticing. God's forgiveness is complete, not partial. When he forgives, he releases, restores, and renews. Yet many people live as if forgiveness must be earned again and again through suffering. They punish themselves emotionally, believing pain proves remorse. But self-punishment does not produce righteousness. It produces fear. Conviction leads to change and freedom, but condemnation leads to paralysis. If a thought constantly pushes you backward instead of guiding you forward, it is not serving your growth, no matter how convincing it feels. Holding on to past mistakes also distorts perception. You begin to see life through the lens of what went wrong rather than what is possible. Every challenge feels like confirmation of failure. Every delay feels like consequence. Every setback feels deserved. This mindset quietly reshapes expectations, causing people to aim lower, risk less, and settle more often than they should, not because God limited them, but because they limited themselves by refusing to release the past. Salting past mistakes also affects relationships. When someone sees themselves as flawed beyond repair, they approach others with insecurity and fear. They over-explain, over-apologize, or emotionally withdraw, assuming rejection is inevitable. This creates distance where on was possible. The past, though forgiven, continues to speak louder than the present. But growth requires agreement with who you are becoming, not who you used to be. True humility is not living in constant guilt. It is living in gratitude for grace. God does not remind you of who you were to shame you. He reminds you of where you came from to show how far you've grown. When the mind refuses to move forward, it contradicts the work God has already completed. You cannot walk confidently into a new season while carrying old accusations that no longer belong to you. Letting go of past mistakes does not mean forgetting wisdom gained from them. It means releasing the emotional weight that no longer serves you. The lesson stays, the shame leaves. The insight remains, the guilt dissolves. This is how maturity forms. The past becomes a reference, not a residence. You remember enough to grow, but not enough to stay trapped. When you stop salting forgiven mistakes, clarity returns. Purpose feels reachable again. Confidence rebuilds slowly but steadily. You begin to trust yourself, not because you are perfect, but because you are no longer defined by imperfection. Grace becomes more than a concept. It becomes a lived experience. You move forward without constantly looking over your shoulder. The future does not need a perfect past. It needs a healed one. And healing does not happen by revisiting what God has already released. It happens by agreeing with him that the old chapter is closed. When you stop preserving the past through guilt and self-condemnation, you make room for growth, peace, and the fulfillment of what God has always intended for your life. What a person repeatedly focuses on does not stay neutral, it grows. Attention is never passive. Whatever the mind returns to again and again begins to shape emotions, decisions, and ultimately destiny. This is why you emotionally salt will survive and eventually dominate your inner world. Salt strengthens what already exists, and focus does the same. When energy is poured consistently into a thought, a feeling, or a memory, it gains influence. Over time, it stops being a passing moment and becomes a controlling voice. Many people believe their thoughts simply happen to them, but in reality, most dominant thoughts are cultivated. They are strengthened through repetition. Fear becomes powerful not because it appears once, but because it is revisited daily. Anxiety grows not because of one concern, but because the mind keeps returning to the same worry. Regret tightens its grip not because of one mistake, but because it is mentally replayed until it feels permanent. Focus is the fuel and emotion is the accelerator. What you give attention to will eventually ask for obedience. A thought that is repeatedly entertained begins to influence behavior. Fear begins to dictate choices. Doubt begins to limit action. Bitterness begins to color perception. This is how inner focus slowly becomes outer reality. Life does not change first, the mind does. And when the mind is dominated by what should have been released, progress feels impossible no matter how much effort is applied. This is why some people feel exhausted without doing much physically. Their energy is being consumed internally. They are fighting old battles in their thoughts, replaying conversations, reimagining outcomes, and rehearsing pain. Emotionally salting these moments keeps them alive. The body may be in the present, but the mind is stuck in the past or anxious about the future. Peace cannot exist where focus is fragmented. Focus also determines emotional tone. If disappointment is constantly revisited, hope begins to fade. If anger is repeatedly justified, patience weakens. If insecurity is entertained, confidence dries up. The mind adapts to what it sees most often. Eventually, what you focus on feels normal, even if it is unhealthy. This is how dysfunction becomes familiar and healing feels uncomfortable. What makes this dangerous is that focus often feels involuntary. Thoughts appear automatically, but dwelling on them is a choice. You may not control what enters your mind, but you do control what you allow to stay. Repeated focus is agreement. When you linger on a thought, you give it permission to influence you. And once it gains influence, it demands more attention, creating a cycle that feels difficult to break. Emotionally salting negative thoughts also distorts reality. You begin to see life through a narrow lens shaped by what you focus on most. A few negative experiences outweigh many positive ones. One failure overshadows multiple successes. One rejection feels bigger than years of acceptance. The mind exaggerates what it consumes regularly. This is why perspective matters as much as circumstance. Focus is powerful because it shapes identity. Over time, people become what they consistently think about. A person who focuses on limitation begins to see themselves as limited. A person who focuses on loss begins to live cautiously. A person who focuses on growth begins to expand. Identity does not form overnight. It forms through repeated internal conversations. And the dominant voice in those conversations is shaped by focus. When attention shifts, everything shifts. The moment focus is redirected, energy follows. When you stop feeding fear, courage begins to rise. When you stop rehearsing regret, confidence slowly returns. When you stop magnifying obstacles, solutions become visible. This does not mean ignoring reality. It means choosing where to place emphasis. Wisdom is knowing what deserves your attention and what does not. The mind cannot be empty. It will always focus on something. If you do not choose intentionally, it will default to familiarity. This is why discipline is required. Not discipline of action alone, but discipline of thought. You must decide what deserves space in your mind. Not every thought is true. Not every emotion is trustworthy. Not every memory deserves. Replay. When you stop salting negative focus points, they weaken. They lose intensity. They fade naturally. What once felt overwhelming becomes manageable. What once dominated your thinking becomes background noise. And in that space, peace begins to grow. Clarity returns, direction sharpens. You begin to experience freedom, not because circumstances changed, but because focus did. Life moves in the direction of dominant thought. What you repeatedly focus on will shape your future. When attention is placed wisely, growth becomes inevitable. When it is misplaced, stagnation follows. Understanding this truth gives you power, not over everything, but over what matters most. Your focus is not just attention, it is alignment. And when aligned correctly, it leads you forward instead of keeping you trapped. True strength is often misunderstood. Many people believe strength means enduring pain silently, holding on at all costs, or constantly revisiting difficult experiences to prove resilience. But real strength is not found in reliving what hurt you. It is found in releasing it. Strength is not the ability to survive pain repeatedly, but the wisdom to move forward without carrying it. Letting go is not weakness. It is maturity. It requires courage to stop touching wounds that no longer need to be opened and to trust that healing has already begun. Reliving pain can feel justified because it creates the illusion of control. By revisiting the past, people believe they are staying alert, protecting themselves from future harm, but in reality, constantly replaying painful moment. S keeps the nervous system in a state of defense. The body remains tense. The mind remains guarded. Peace becomes difficult to access because the heart is always bracing for what already happened. This is not protection, it is imprisonment. Strength is not staying ready for yesterday's battle. It is recognizing that the battle has ended. Moving forward requires trust. It requires trusting that what happened does not have to happen again. It requires trusting that you can handle life without constantly scanning for danger. Many people hold on to pain because they fear that releasing it will make them vulnerable. But healing does not make you careless. It makes you clearer. It sharpens discernment without hardening the heart. When pain is released, wisdom remains. The lesson stays, but the fear dissolves. There's a difference between remembering and reliving. Remembering informs growth. Reliving recreates suffering. When someone repeatedly relives painful experiences, they emotionally place themselves back in moments where they were powerless. The body responds as if the threat is present again. Stress hormones rise, anxiety increases, confidence shrinks. Over time, this pattern trains the mind to associate safety with pain because pain feels familiar. But familiarity is not the same as health. True strength is the ability to sit with peace without feeling the need to disrupt it. Some people feel uncomfortable when life becomes calm because they have learned to function in chaos. They equate peace with vulnerability and stability with boredom. So they revisit old wounds, replay arguments, or rehearse losses, not because healing hasn't happened, but because pain feels known. Strength breaks this pattern. It allows calm to exist without suspicion. It allows joy to be felt without guilt. Moving forward also requires humility, the humility to accept that you do not need tea. Oh, understand everything before letting go. Some people stay stuck because they are waiting for perfect closure, complete understanding, or final explanations. But not every chapter provides clarity. Some chapters end to free you, not to explain themselves. Strength is trusting that growth does not require full comprehension, only willingness. Letting go also involves releasing identity attachments. Pain can become part of how people define themselves. They introduce themselves to life through their wounds, what they survived, what they lost, what hurt them. While survival stories matter, they are not meant to become permanent identities. Strength allows a person to redefine themselves beyond pain. It says, that happened to me, but it is not who I am. There is a quiet confidence that emerges when pain is no longer the center of attention. Decision-making improves. Relationships become healthier. Emotional reactions soften. When pain no longer dominates the inner world, life opens up. Possibility returns. Hope feels natural again. This is not because life becomes perfect, but because the heart becomes lighter. Releasing pain does not erase the past. It reframes it. The experience becomes part of growth rather than a source of fear. You no longer live in reaction, you live in intention. Strength is no longer measured by how much you can endure, but by how much you can trust. Trust that you are safe now. Trust that you are growing. Trust that you do not need to carry what no longer belongs to you. Moving forward without pain does not mean ignoring reality. It means choosing not to let reality define you through suffering. It means allowing yourself to heal fully without reopening wounds for proof. True strength is peaceful, not loud. It does not announce survival. It demonstrates freedom. And when you learn that strength is found in release, not repetition, you step into a life that is no longer controlled by what hurts you, but guided by what heals you. Prayer is one of the most powerful gifts given to humanity, yet it is often misunderstood. Many people approach prayer as a tool to control outcomes, reverse endings, or revive what has already expired. But prayer was never designed to override God's will. It was designed to align the human heart with it. When prayer is used to hold on to what God is releasing, it creates internal conflict instead of peace. The struggle is not because prayer failed, but because prayer is being used against the direction God is already leading. When God closes a door, he does not do it randomly or cruelly. He does it with foresight, seeing what you cannot yet see. But emotional attachment can be so strong that instead of asking God what he is doing, people ask him to undo what he has done. They pray for people to return, for seasons to reopen, for situations to revive, even when those very things were draining, limiting, or harming them. This creates confusion because the heart is asking for familiarity while God is offering growth. Prayer that resists release often sounds spiritual on the surface, but internally it is rooted in fear. Fear of loneliness, fear of change, fear of uncertainty, fear of starting over. Instead of trusting that God's removal has purpose, the heart clings to what feels safe simply because it is known. But safety and familiarity are not the same. God often removes what feels safe to lead you into what is healthy. True prayer changes the one who is praying. It softens resistance. It brings clarity. It reveals truth. When prayer is genuine, it does not increase anxiety. It reduces it. If praying about a situation makes you more restless, more confused, and more emotionally stuck, it may be because the prayer is fighting what God is already doing. Alignment brings peace, even when the answer is difficult. Resistance brings turmoil, even when the request feels sincere. Many people believe that persistence in prayer means never letting go. But there is a difference between persistence and insistence. Persistence seeks God's heart. Insistence seeks control. Jesus himself prayed, not for his will to be done, but for alignment with the Father's will. That is the highest form of prayer, surrender. When surrender is missing, prayer becomes exhausting because the soul is pulling in the opposite direction of grace. God does not need to be convinced to do what is best for you. He does not need reminders of your pain to justify his decisions. When he removes someone or something, it is often because that connection cannot go Here he is taking you. Reviving it through prayer does not make it fit the future. It only delays your readiness for what's next. Prayer is meant to prepare you for the future, not trap you in the past. There is also a subtle danger in spiritualizing attachment. Sometimes people say, God hasn't answered yet, when in reality, the answer was already given through. Peace leaving, joy fading, or growth stopping. Silence is not always absence. Sometimes it is confirmation. God often speaks through withdrawal of peace long before he speaks through words. Ignoring that signal and continuing to pray for revival keeps the heart misaligned. When prayer aligns with God, acceptance begins to form. Not resignation, but understanding. You may not like the ending, but you trust the wisdom behind it. Acceptance does not mean the pain disappears instantly, but it means the struggle against reality ends. And when resistance ends, healing accelerates. Aligned prayer sounds different. It says, teach me what this season was meant to give me. It says, help me release what no longer serves my growth. It says, prepare me for what you are building ahead. This kind of prayer does not pull you backward. It strengthens you forward. It opens your hands instead of tightening them. It builds faith instead of feeding fear. God never closes one chapter without preparing another. But preparation requires space. Holding on through misaligned prayer fills that space with noise, confusion, and emotional clutter. Letting go through aligned prayer clears the ground. It allows new relationships, new purpose, and new peace to grow. When prayer is used correctly, it becomes a place of rest, not struggle. It becomes a place where you stop trying to change God's mind and start allowing him to change your heart. And when alignment happens, clarity follows. You may still miss what was, but you know. Longer needed to survive. You may still remember the season, but you no longer live in it. Prayer does not fail when it leads you to release. That is success. Because prayer's greatest purpose is not to keep everything the same, but to shape you into someone who can walk confidently into what God is doing next. One of the most destructive habits a person can develop is continually dwelling on past mistakes after forgiveness has already been given. Shame does not need new evidence to survive. It only needs attention. When the mind repeatedly returns to what went wrong, self-condemnation quietly takes root, even when restoration has already taken place. God may have forgiven, healed, and moved forward, but if the heart refuses to follow, shame becomes a self-imposed prison. The mistake is no longer active in reality, yet it remains active in identity. Shame works by convincing a person that what they did is who they are. It turns an action into a definition and a moment into a lifetime label. When someone keeps revisiting past failures, the mind stops seeing them as experiences and starts seeing them as proof of unworthiness. Confidence weakens, not because ability is gone, but because self-trust has been eroded. Even blessings begin to feel undeserved, and progress feels uncomfortable because the heart believes punishment is still required. Self-condemnation feels responsible at first. It disguises itself as humility, accountability, or maturity. People say they are being cautious, honest, or reflective, but reflection that leads to growth is different from rumination that leads to shame. Growth asks, what did I learn? Shame asks, what is wrong with me? One produces wisdom, the other produces paralysis. When the mind keeps asking the wrong question, it stays stuck in the wrong place. God's forgiveness is not fragile. It does not depend on how long you feel bad afterward. Forgiveness is complete, decisive, and intentional. When God forgives, he releases you from debt, not places you on emotional probation. Continuing to punish yourself does not honor repentance. It resists grace. Grace is meant to lift you, not leave you bowed down in perpetual guilt. Refusing to move forward after forgiveness is not righteousness. It is mistrust. Shame also distorts perception of the present. When someone lives under self-condemnation, every challenge feels like confirmation of past failure. Every delay feels deserved. Every closed door feels like punishment. The mind begins to interpret life through accusation rather than truth. This mindset does not protect you from repeating mistakes. It actually increases the likelihood because fear weakens clarity and confidence. Dwelling on past mistakes also interferes with relationships. People who carry shame struggle to receive love fully. Compliments feel uncomfortable. Support feels suspicious. Connection feels risky. They may over-explain themselves, over-apologize, or emotionally withdraw, believing rejection is inevitable. The past becomes louder than the present, and self-condemnation becomes a barrier to intimacy and trust. There is a critical difference between conviction and condemnation. Conviction points forward. It identifies what needs to change and then releases you to grow. Condemnation pulls backward. It reminds you of what happened and demands you stay there emotionally. Conviction produces hope and action. Condemnation produces heaviness and fear. If a thought leads you closer to freedom, it is serving growth. If it keeps you trapped in guilt with no path forward, it is not from God. Shame survives through repetition. Every time you replay the mistake, reimagine the outcome, or mentally scold yourself, you strengthen its voice. The past may be closed, but attention keeps opening it. This is why letting go is a discipline, not a feeling. You may still remember what happened, but you must choose not to live there. The lesson stays, the accusation leaves. Forgiving yourself is not ignoring responsibility. It is accepting restoration. It is agreeing with God's assessment rather than your own harsh judgment. When you forgive yourself, you are not excusing the mistake. You are acknowledging that growth has occurred. You are honoring who you are becoming instead of who you used to be. A healed past does not disappear. It loses its power. It no longer defines decisions, limits confidence, or shapes identity. You remember without bleeding. You recall without collapsing. You move forward without dragging chains that were already unlocked. This is what freedom looks like. Not perfection, but peace. The future requires emotional space. Self-condemnation fills that space with noise, guilt, and fear. Letting go clears it. When shame is released, clarity returns. Courage rebuilds. Purpose feels accessible again. You stop shrinking your life to match your mistakes and start expanding it to match your growth. You were never meant to live as a reminder of your worst moment. You were meant to live as evidence of grace. And when you stop dwelling on what God has already forgiven, you allow your life to reflect restoration instead of regret. There is a crucial difference between conviction and condemnation. Yet many people confuse the two and suffer unnecessarily because of it. Conviction is meant to guide you toward growth, while condemnation is designed to trap you in guilt. One comes from love and leads to freedom. The other feeds on fear and leads to stagnation. Understanding this difference can change how you respond to mistakes, challenges, and inner struggles, because not every uncomfortable feeling is meant to keep you stuck. Conviction has. Clear purpose. It reveals what needs to change, but it never attacks who you are. It points to behavior, not identity. When conviction is present, there is still hope, clarity, and a sense that improvement is possible. Even though it may feel uncomfortable, it carries direction. It says, this needs to shift, and you are capable of growing beyond it. Conviction does not linger endlessly. It does its work and then releases you forward. It corrects without crushing and instructs without humiliating. Condemnation, on the other hand, has no interest in growth. Its goal is to keep you emotionally anchored to failure. It focuses not on what happened, but on what it claims you are. It replaces I did something wrong with I am something wrong. Instead of offering a way forward, it loops the mind backward. The same mistake is replayed again and again, not to learn from it, but to reinforce shame. Condemnation does not lead to change. It leads to paralysis. One of the clearest signs of condemnation is hopelessness. When a thought leaves you feeling heavy, defeated, and disconnected from the desire to try again, it is not serving your growth. Conviction may bring discomfort, but it always leaves room for restoration. Condemnation removes that space and replaces it with self-accusation. It convinces you that improvement is pointless, that you will always fail, or that you are permanently damaged. These thoughts do not protect you, they weaken you. Condemnation often disguises itself as responsibility. People believe that if they keep feeling bad long enough, it proves sincerity or humility. But prolonged guilt does not produce character, it produces fear. Fear-based change never lasts because it is rooted in self-hatred rather than self-awareness. Growth that comes from conviction is sustainable because it is built on truth and grace, not punishment. Another danger of condemnation is that it distorts how you see God, yourself, and others. When you live under constant self-judgment, you begin to assume judgment everywhere. You expect rejection. You misinterpret silence as disapproval. You struggle to receive encouragement because condemnation has trained you to distrust kindness. The inner voice becomes harsh, and eventually the outer world feels harsh too. This is not reality. It is perception shaped by shame. Conviction brings responsibility without removing dignity. It says you are accountable but still valuable. Condemnation removes dignity and replaces it with labels. Once dignity is lost, motivation disappears. People who feel condemned stop trying, not because they don't care, but because they feel incapable of change. This is why condemnation is so destructive. It steals the belief that growth is possible. Condemnation also keeps people spiritually stagnant. Instead of moving closer to God, they withdraw, believing they must fix themselves before returning. But conviction draws you closer. It invites transformation through relationship, not isolation. The closer you are to grace, the easier change becomes. Condemnation pushes you away from the very source that could heal you. The way to break free from condemnation is not to argue with it emotionally, but to recognize its pattern. If a thought keeps you stuck in the past with no path forward, it is not from God. If it attacks your identity instead of addressing behavior, it is not from God. If it produces fear instead of hope, it is not from God. Growth always carries an invitation forward. Letting conviction do its work requires honesty and humility. You acknowledge what needs to change, take responsibility, and then release the moment. You don't keep reopening it for punishment. You don't keep reminding yourself of it as proof of unworthiness. You learn, adjust, and move forward. That is how conviction fulfills its purpose. When condemnation is removed, emotional energy returns. Confidence begins to rebuild. You stop measuring yourself by past failures and start measuring yourself by present growth. You become willing to try again, not because you are fearless, but because you are no longer afraid of being defined by a mistake. Freedom does not come from pretending nothing went wrong. It comes from refusing to let what went wrong become who you are. Conviction leads you out. Condemnation keeps you in. And when you learn to recognize the difference, you stop fighting yourself and start walking forward with clarity, peace, and renewed strength. Everything in life responds to focus. What you repeatedly think about, talk about, and emotionally engage with begins to shape the direction of your life. Focus is not just attention, it is alignment. It directs energy, influences decisions, and determines what grows and what fades. This is why life consistently moves in the direction of dominant thought. The mind is not a passive observer of reality. It is an active participant in shaping it. When a thought is given repeated attention, it becomes familiar. Familiarity breeds comfort. Even when the thought itself is unhealthy, fear becomes normal, doubt feels reasonable, limitation feels logical. Over time, these thoughts stop feeling like intrusions and start feeling like truth. This is how people slowly accept realities they never consciously chose. The mind adapts to what it sees most often, and life follows that adaptation. Focus shapes emotional responses. If attention is placed consistently on loss, sadness becomes the emotional default. If attention stays on threat, anxiety becomes the natural reaction. If focus rests on disappointment, hope weakens. Emotions are trained, not random. They respond to repeated patterns of thought. What you dwell on teaches your nervous system how to react to the world. This is why some people feel calm in chaos and uneasy in peace. Their focus has conditioned them. Dominant thought also influences behavior. Choices are made based on what the mind believes is most real. If fear dominates thought, decisions become defensive. If confidence dominates, decisions become courageous. If scarcity dominates, decisions become cautious. Behavior follows belief, and belief is shaped by focus. Long before a person acts, they have already agreed internally with a certain narrative about life and themselves. Over time, focus becomes identity. A person who consistently thinks about failure begins to see themselves as incapable. A person who focuses on growth begins to see themselves as capable of learning. Identity is not formed by a single thought, but by repeated ones. The internal dialogue you maintain becomes the lens through which you interpret every experience. This is why two people can face the same situation and respond completely differently. Their dominant thoughts are different. Focus also affects perception of opportunity. When the mind is trained to look for obstacles, it will find them everywhere. When it is trained to look for possibility, it will recognize opportunity even in difficulty. Life does not change first. Perception does, and perception determines response. This is why some people grow through hardship while others shrink. The difference is not circumstance, it is focus. What makes focus so powerful is that it often operates unconsciously. People rarely sit down and decide to focus on fear or regret. It happens gradually through repetition. A thought appears, attention lingers, emotion responds, and a pattern forms. Without awareness, this cycle repeats until it feels automatic. Breaking the cycle requires intention. You must notice what you are feeding mentally and emotionally. Focus is not about ignoring reality. It is about choosing emphasis. You can acknowledge challenges without letting them dominate your thinking. You can recognize risk without living in fear. You can remember the past without being controlled by it. Balance is not denial, it is discernment. Wisdom chooses what deserves the most attention. When focus shifts, internal energy shifts with it. What once felt overwhelming becomes manageable. What once felt permanent begins to feel temporary. The mind gains flexibility, and with flexibility comes resilience. This is how growth begins, not by changing everything at once, but by changing where attention rests. Sustained focus on growth produces momentum. Confidence builds slowly as evidence accumulates. Each small win reinforces belief. Each positive experience strengthens a new narrative. Over time, the dominant thought changes and life follows. This is not instant transformation, it is consistent alignment. Life will always move toward what you think about most, not what you want occasionally. Desire without focus remains intention. Focus turns intention into direction. When you become intentional about what occupies your mind, you regain influence over your future. The power of focus is not in perfection, but in consistency. You will not always think perfectly, but you can think intentionally. And as you learn to guide your attention, you learn to guide your life. What you focus on will grow. What you starve of attention will weaken. Understanding this truth gives you one of the greatest tools for transformation, control over the direction of your inner world, which ultimately shapes the outer one. Peace, clarity, and forward movement do not come from doing more. They come from releasing what no longer belongs. Many people exhaust themselves trying to fix, revive, or carry things that were never meant to stay with them. They pray harder, think longer, and try more intensely, yet nothing changes because the real solution is not effort, it is release. Growth often begins not with addition, but with subtraction. When what needs to leave is finally allowed to go, space is created for healing, direction, and renewal. There are things in life that only weaken when attention is removed. Struggles that feel overwhelming often survive because they are being fed emotionally. Wounds heal faster when they are not constantly reopened. Doors close permanently when knocking stops. Chains break fully when they are no longer touched. Letting go is not passive, it is an intentional act of trust. It requires believing that what God has removed does not need to be revisited for closure, explanation, or validation. Release brings clarity because it simplifies the inner world. When the mind is cluttered with unresolved attachments, old pain, and lingering regret, decision-making becomes cloudy. Everything feels complicated. Once release happens, mental noise decreases. Thoughts become sharper. Emotions stabilize. You begin to see situations as they are, not through the distortion of what was. Clarity is not always about gaining information. Sometimes it is about losing distraction. Peace follows release because resistance ends. Much of emotional suffering comes from fighting reality, wanting things to be different than they are. When resistance stops, energy returns. The heart no longer pulls in opposite directions. Acceptance does not mean approval, it means alignment. You stop wasting strength on what cannot be changed and redirect it toward what can be built. Forward movement requires clean hands. You cannot walk confidently into the future while gripping the past. Old attachments slow momentum. They create hesitation, doubt, and second guessing. When hands are open, movement becomes natural. Opportunities are easier to receive. Change feels less threatening. Release restores agility to the soul. Letting go also strengthens trust. Each release is a declaration that you believe something better is possible, even if you cannot see it yet. Trust grows through experience. And every time you release what no longer serves you, you reinforce the belief that life can move forward without collapse. This builds confidence, not arrogance, but quiet assurance. Many people delay release because they confuse it with loss, but loss takes, release chooses. Loss leaves emptiness. Release creates space. What feels like loss at first often becomes relief later. The weight lifts. Breathing becomes easier. Joy begins to return gradually. This is not coincidence. It is the natural result of alignment. Release also restores energy. Emotional attachment drains strength when it is misplaced. When energy is no longer spent on maintaining what is dead, it becomes available for what is alive. Creativity returns. Motivation increases. Hope feels accessible again. Life responds quickly when energy is no longer tied up in resistance. Letting go does not erase memory, it changes relationship to it. The past no longer controls emotional responses. You remember without pain dominating the present. You reflect without reliving. This is freedom, not forgetting, but being unaffected by what once held power. Release prepares you for the next season. Growth requires space. New relationships, ideas, and opportunities cannot fully enter when the heart is overcrowded. Clearing space is an act of preparation, even when what's coming is still unseen. You make room not because you know exactly what will fill it, but because you trust that something will. The future does not demand perfection, it demands availability. When you release what is no longer aligned, you become available for peace, growth, and purpose. Clean hands, a clear heart, and an undistracted mind create momentum. Life begins to move again, not because circumstances changed, but because you did. True freedom is not found in holding on harder, but in knowing when to let go. And when you finally release what was never meant to stay, you discover that peace was not lost. It was waiting for you to make room for it.